The Ontario Medical Association voted last weekend to approve a process that makes binding arbitration available for negotiations with the provincial government. It's the latest in a series of Labour resolutions that put the Premier and her Liberal team ostensibly on a path to Labour peace. A year out from an election, is that good policy, good politics, both, or neither? Lots of options to consider for Martin Redcon, Ontario politics columnist at the Toronto Star, and Jessica Smith-Cross, Queen's Park correspondent with the Canadian Press. And I'm happy to welcome you two three named people to TVO tonight, and you for the first time. Welcome, Jessica. Nice to have you here. Okay, can we start with this? I need to understand this. For the longest time, the government of Ontario was refusing to offer binding arbitration as an option in dealing with the doctors and their very protracted contract negotiations. Then recently they said, okay, binding arbitration. And this past weekend, the doc said, good, sign us up, we're okay with that. What's changed?
The clock ran out on the government. We are about 1 year away from the next provincial election, and for the last 3 or so years, the government has had the ability, the margin of maneuver, to do what it wanted, not entirely unilaterally, because after all, we talk a lot about arbitration now, but there was mediation a couple of years ago with the former Chief Justice of Ontario, so there were efforts to bring both sides together. And both sides actually came together a year ago, as you know, and the OMA executive endorsed a deal that both sides negotiated of their own free will.
And the docs turned it down.
It fell down, it fell apart, the doctors turned it down, and Dr. Eric Hoskins, who was the health minister, said then and until very recently, no arbitration. As recently as the end of last year, this is not on because it costs the government money, and we can talk more about that later.
We will.
But there is an election coming along, and the government has decided that it doesn't need the heat from 35,000 doctors and all of their patients, doctors being among the most respected professions in Ontario, going after the government before an election.
In which case, it now sets the table for negotiations to come on a new contract. How do you think having binding arbitration as an option changes the dynamic of those negotiations?
First off, it will make sure that they happen. Doctors have been without a contract for more than 3 years. The first stage of the negotiations under the new arbitration framework will be negotiations. Should that fail, mediation. And then should that fail, it goes to an arbitration panel, which will enforce the decision. So for doctors, it will mean having a contract with the government for the first time in more than 3 years. It will also mean that the decisions are ultimately made by an independent third party, not just the government.
And if I understand this right, they don't send the whole thing, the whole contract negotiations out for arbitration. It's individual items in the negotiations that they can't agree on. So presumably that's progress. Is that fair to say?
It should be progress for the doctors and for the government.
Okay. And also, I mean, obviously upside, downside on how these things go. The upside of having binding arbitration as an option is what?
Well, for the government, it means that doctors won't be taking any job action, and that's something that they've threatened to do, and that could be very, very unpopular if patients find it harder to schedule an appointment with their family doctor, for example. For doctors, the upside is they don't have the government making unilateral decisions anymore. There won't be any more clawing back of their wages by surprise or by the government's demand.
Martin, the downside of offering binding arbitration?
Well, the downside is there's always a risk that an arbitrator historically they have tended to award somewhat more generous awards than sometimes the government could afford. People will always say, teachers, civil servants, you just need to raise taxes to afford this. If you want to be a tax cutter like Mike Harris or even Dalton McGuinty, who did actually cut taxes, people don't believe that, then don't make us bear the burden of that. And there's some logic to that. But try to get elected as a politician raising taxes, and you won't be elected. So that's the kind of reality that arbitrators don't often deal with. That's what governments are afraid of. The doctors like to point out that I think 7 other provinces and territories in Canada have arbitration frameworks. What they often forget is that sometimes, it can be more generous than the government can afford. And in the case of BC, the government actually has second thoughts and goes back and legislates or finds a framework to reverse what the arbitrator awarded if they deem it too generous. So it's not perfect, but it is without arbitration on the positive side, there wouldn't be any more negotiation because this whole thing is so complicated. And when a membership rejects an executive's recommendation, which doesn't happen very often in union situations, bearing in mind that doctors are not in a union and they don't behave like most trade unionists, they have their own opinions. When that happens, it's very hard to dig out of that for both sides. So I think as much as the government didn't want arbitration, I think they recognize that with this implosion of the OMA, there wasn't really another path forward. And thanks to Jessica for pointing this out. In some ways, it's actually not a bad political deal for the government because people haven't paid attention to the fine print, which really does, as you point out, prevent the doctors from having any kind of advocacy, let alone letter-writing campaigns, petitions, let alone work stoppages.
And no withdrawal of services as an option anymore.
Not even advocacy. That's pretty good.
Well, they can certainly tell their patients to go make a stink.
Yes.
They can protest, they can write letters, but they can't withdraw their services or take any job action.
Right, and that's proscribed in this tentative deal.
But just tell me this: as I understood this, the government didn't want to offer binding arbitration for the longest time because they were afraid. They've seen the pattern, and it's most often the case that the arbitrator awards something that is more generous than what the government of the day wants. Did this government suddenly find $400 million burning a hole in their pocket that they can suddenly give to doctors to buy labor peace?
Well, that's almost what they've been saying. The government has been trying to save as much money as they can since the recession. It's been tough times. They've held back on a number of fronts. And now they say, we've balanced our budget, now we can afford to pay people again.
How about this angle? I remember, it might have been a couple of elections ago, Tim Hudak, when he was leading the Conservatives, said, we need to change the arbitration process to take into account whether the government can actually afford the settlement that an arbitrator might order. Do you think the Liberals might revisit that in order to avoid what could be a hefty payday at the end of the day?
They tried to revisit the arbitration framework a couple of years ago during the minority government, and they were not able to secure the support of both the Tories and New Democrats. You're right that under Hudak, the progressive Conservatives have had very strong views about the built-in costs of arbitration. But the problem with arbitration is not just one particular settlement, but it's a kind of an arbitrage where they will then look at what other policemen or police officers or firefighters or nurses have received in other jurisdictions, and there's a kind of a constant leapfrogging or catching up that happens. Yeah. And that's what the Tories were most upset about. Under the new leader, Patrick Brown, they have changed tack or emphasis on arbitration, and Mr. Brown has been much harder to read. He kind of has implied to doctors that he was willing to look at arbitration without committing to it, actually. Right. So it's very unclear whether the Conservatives in government would be as friendly to the doctors as they say they are now.
Well, I think Patrick Brown, unlike Tim Hudak, has tried very hard to ingratiate himself to the unions, and therefore, this is all consistent, I guess. I mean, do we know that he signs on to all this as well?
He hasn't been very specific. He had the same or similar line to Health Minister Eric Hoskins before this agreement, that he was willing to talk about binding arbitration, he was willing to go there, but no promise. He didn't say this is a given, this is something we'll give, it's on the table. I just wanted to say Martin made a really good point about arbitration. He did.
Really? Okay.
The arbitration framework says that the arbitrators must take into account the economic realities of the province, but it does not say the government can't raise taxes in order to pay the arbitrated settlement with doctors.
So if this does get to binding arbitration at the end of the day, some of the compensation issues, it's going to be fascinating to see, how much this is going to end up costing people at the end of the day. But we shall see. Let me read something here, as galling as this will be for the two of you, from the Toronto Sun. Sorry, neither of your work represented here. But here's a good piece by Patrick Nelson, who writes, "Money is the root of the issue for both sides. Government wants a hard cap on the physician services budget. Sounds simple enough, but when you consider the growing needs of an aging population and the thousands of newcomers that arrive to the province each year, it is a tall order. The only way to cap the physician services budget is to cut the per-service fees doctors receive. Despite what you might read, most doctors can accept a freeze on their compensation, but they can't accept that they should be made to pay for the growing costs of delivering health services in reduced fees." I wonder, Martin, whether the docs have a point here. They say everything's getting costlier, and apparently the government is making the docs and the docs alone pay for the added expenses to the system. Is that fair?
There's no magic answer to that. We have to bear in mind that doctors are the gatekeepers of the system. We entrust them with that professional and ethical judgment which they carry out. They also are the most expensive single component in a $50 billion plus healthcare budget, about $11 billion a year. So that's a big pot of money to have no control over if you're trying to have a reasonable budget. One reason why the government is being a little more flexible now, apart from the election horizon, is the revenue horizon. They have more money now than they had 2-3 years ago when they were sitting tight. So their margin of maneuver has actually increased. But there is no easy answer to that. You have a system here of almost cost plus. A doctor can bill as much as he wants. There is no actual limit on, effectively, on how many patients they can see. And so if you have that envelope and doctors exceed it consistently, how do you actually control your budget? Doctors will say, well, we are underpaid for what we do, or we haven't kept up. They are still, you know, when it comes to an arbitrator and arbitrage, let's not forget, they are the best paid doctors in Canada. And the last time that a mediator, the former Chief Justice, looked at it, he came up with 1.25%. In this last agreement, which fell apart.
Sorry, that refers to 1.25%
per year. Yeah.
Per year increase in compensation.
Correct. But with caps. And as you say, caps are what make it difficult. Like you can't exceed a certain amount. So this current agreement, the most recent agreement that was negotiated last summer, which fell apart despite the OMA's recommendation to accept it, was 2.5% a year for 4 years. So let's not assume that an arbitrator is going to go much higher than that, because he might say, well, that's not a bad deal.
Jessica, at the risk of getting into the weeds here, and I think I actually have a copy of this right here. This is something called the Price-Baker Report. And the province of Ontario got this report, it's more than 2 years ago now, and it's essentially a look at how primary care in the province might be reformed to be more effective, efficient, and so on and so forth. I'm not sure how much progress they've made on this because there's been this obsession on the contract negotiations that have gone nowhere. Is there any indication that you have seen that the recommendations in this report and the opportunity to reform the system, that the province can now better focus on this now that this whole arbitration issue is sort of put to bed?
Yeah, I'll take a step back here and say that the groundwork for that change, that systemic change, was laid with the Patients First Act. So that does a lot of things, but one of the important ones when it comes to doctors is it creates some linkages between primary care and the LHINs. And
local health integration
networks, the 14 geographic regions in the province. With the movement toward doctors having a contract with the arbitration framework, there will be more room for the government to continue that transition. The primary way in which the Ministry of Health organizes primary care is through family health teams, and that is part of the compensation that can be arbitrated under the new framework. It's complicated stuff, but it will allow, I think, the Ministry of Health to move forward into the direction that it wants to go.
So it sounds like that because the province and the doctors now agree on a process by which to renegotiate the next contract, that both sides actually have bought themselves maybe a little goodwill to actually focus on repairing the system. Is that fair to say?
Peace on the horizon will definitely help, yeah.
It will help. Go ahead, Martin.
Just to quickly jump in, it's a bit of both because, as Jessica points out, Dr. Hoskins tried to bring family doctors in greater, within the rubric, within the, not control, but within the sphere of these health coordinating bodies across the province. But in that tentative deal, which fell apart last summer, they actually took that out. The government promised to actually not go forward with that. So, on the other hand, if goodwill can somehow be achieved, if they can put all this bad blood behind them, then there is greater prospect for some kind of cooperation. You actually do need to have doctors as partners in the system. And when you're...
Well, they run the system.
When you're disrespecting them or not respecting them or pointing out how much money they're paid, even if you might be right about that, doctors don't take kindly to that.
Doesn't buy goodwill. Let's remind everybody that the doctors are not the only labor group in the province who are making news these days. And I do want to point out that OPSEU, the Ontario Public Servants Employees Union, recently reached a deal on a 4-year contract extension. And let's just read this quote here from Smokey Thomas, who is quoted in the Canadian press, I might add, from just last week, in which he says, "I'm kind of shocked the government actually made us any kind of an offer. It's no secret that my union and myself, my executive board, we're always in a battle with the government. We're at odds with them on a lot of fronts. And yet, here we go. Labor peace is broken out. How come?"
Well, I think there are two competing narratives for why that could be. The one you're most likely to hear from the government is that they've balanced their budget for the first time since their recession, and now they can afford this. A more cynical person might think it might have something to do with labor peace ahead of the next election.
You're not a cynical person, so you don't think that.
Oh, I have no opinions.
How about you?
Well, Jessica's laid out the two competing schools of thought, but there's a third way to look at this, which is that teachers, also doctors, civil servants, public servants in other sectors, in hospitals, correctional service officers, have actually done their bit over the last few years. I think that the impetus for restraint was austerity. There actually wasn't that much money coming through in terms of cash flow compared to what there used to be in the Dalton McGuinty years when the economy was roaring, and he could afford to buy off the doctors and buy off the teachers with big, chunky agreements. 12% for the teachers over 4 years, and the doctors got a huge chunk of money midway through the Dalton McGuinty years. So another, as I say, a case can be made that the doctors, the teachers, the LCBO workers are ready for a bit of catch-up.
Let's, since you mentioned the LCBO workers, talk about that one, because of course we're coming up to a holiday weekend, which obviously gives the employees at the LCBO a bit of, what would you say, like timely power in their negotiations with the government. How problematic is it to what the government is trying to do on the labor front if the LCBO workers go on strike just in advance of the Canada Day weekend?
I don't think that would be a popular thing for the government. I think if it's harder to get alcohol in the province, the government will hear about it.
I mean, if you look at the approach that they're taking to the LCBO compared to all the other labor unions, do we assume at the 11th hour they're going to come in with something to save the day and buy peace?
I don't think that would be a bad idea for them.
Martin, how do you see it?
Well, historically, that's always happened. Every single time they go to the brink at the 11th hour, they do a deal. And the difference this time is that the playing field has changed. It's not just an LCBO operation plus our friends at the beer store. We now have grocery stores that are also selling wine and beer. And so that puts pressure on the LCBO to keep its costs down and its flexibility at where it is. But it also puts pressure on OPSEU to not make the LCBO a lightning rod for people. It's not always clear how the public comes down on this. They might blame the government. They might also blame the union. There's a perception out there, I think a little exaggerated, that LCBO workers are paid in bags of gold bullion.
Well, $27 an hour is the average wage, which is not bad.
It's not bad, but they actually, people like the LCBO and they like the employees there, and it's a happy group. So I think what I'm getting at though is that I think the union recognizes too that it doesn't have as much leverage as people might think because they're not a monopoly anymore. There are competing outlets available for wine and beer and competing workers, unionized workers, who are also selling it.
Can you, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, and you can see OPSEU trying to change the public's perception of LCBO jobs. They've released these LikiLeaks videos about the videos of LCBO workers tearfully talking about their poor working conditions, their inability to have assurance and getting enough shifts to make it through the end of the week, that kind of thing. They're definitely trying to change the perception that working at the LCBO is a cushy job.
Can you tell whether those videos have had any impact on public opinion in as much as have they created more sympathy for the union's position on these issues?
It's hard to say. I think trying to read the public's view of unions is always tricky. Some people like to beat up on unions, and Mr. Hudak used to like to do that. Patrick Brown doesn't do that, so we don't have that factor. Tim Hudak used to make fun of union bosses and overpaid unions, and I think that dynamic has been removed a little bit. It's worth pointing out, though, that the LCBO has been one of the worst offenders in terms of exploiting the part-time work system and precarious employment. And I think that the government, because it's brought in some workplace review reforms to try to force employers to treat part-time workers in a fair and equitable way, the LCBO is on the spotlight for that.
Can I just get one concluding comment from you, Jess, on the fact that with almost in all sectors of what the province has dominion over, labor peace breaking out, what do the opposition parties think about the way things are all rolling out these days?
I would imagine that's a scary thought for them. When you couple the labor peace with the relatively popular labor law changes that the provincial government is bringing in, it does set the stage for the Liberals to have a lot of labor support in 2018.
And a new poll out today, Campaign Research's poll, shows the Progressive Conservatives with an 8-point lead over the Liberals, 38 to 30, NDP at 24. That's still a fairly tight, as unpopular as the Premier is personally, that is a fairly, Martin, tight race.
Oh, very much so, and it's all, at the end of the day, it's about brand. I mean, Andrea Horwath has been the most popular leader in Ontario since she was almost elected 9 years ago, but she's always come in third. So it's the party brand that actually is most often associated with that. The other aspect, though, about the opposition and the labor piece is that Patrick Brown, to his credit, has been reaching out to the unions. I suspect the unions might break his heart in the end.
We shall see, and we'll have you two back to consider it in the days ahead, probably more like the months ahead. We thank you both for contributing to our program tonight. Martin Redcon of the Toronto Star and Jessica Smith-Cross, Queen's Park correspondent of the Canadian Press. Your first time here. Great to have you both.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.